We're recording episode 3 of Pandemicast on Friday, the 27th of March. So please do bear that in mind as you watch it, because a lot of what we're talking about will change very fast. Thank you for joining us. It's good to have you with us. And I'm joined by a fascinating panel this week. We're going to focus on vaccines. We're going to focus on vaccines potentially against COVID-19 itself, and on the impact of COVID-19 on other immunization programs. Now, a word of warning, this is going to run long because we've had a small pre-discussion and there's an awful lot to talk about. But I think you'll find it interesting and I think you'll want to stick with us through all of it. I'm joined by Lenore Cooney, who is one of the founders of Baird CMC. I met Lenore, I think, in the 1990s when she was running Ogilvy and Mather, New York. She's been involved in communication about flu vaccines, about adult immunization in general, for 35 years. And she worked with the National Foundation for Infectious Diseases in the US to convene groups and to build constituencies of support for the expansion of adult immunization. I'm joined also by Joël Calmet, who, in the interest of full disclosure, was a client of ours for many years at Sanofi Pasteur, where he was head of scientific communications. Sanofi Pasteur, for those of you who may not know, is the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world. And Joël is now an advisor to Baird CMC and joins us today. And then finally, I'm joined by Lois Prevost-Dunn, who's in Pennsylvania at home, but is normally at Johns Hopkins University at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. And again, in the interest of disclosure, has been a client of ours in the past. She's the director of adult vaccination, and she's also the director of policy advocacy and communications at IVAC at Hopkins. Finally, in her many roles, she heads the secretariat of the International Council on Adult Immunization, which is trying to raise awareness of the need for more platforms for adult immunization. So a distinguished and very well-informed group. Kieran Watts is also joining us from our office here in Wales, or from our home working here in Wales. Kieran is going to give us an update at the end of the program on how media and social media have been talking about vaccination. So welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us. I think I'd like to start, if I may, on this subject that is discussed so often at presidential news conferences, at prime ministerial news conferences, in the news media, a vaccine against COVID-19, a vaccine against the coronavirus. It's difficult to know where to start, but I think I might start with you, Lenore. Do you want to talk us through a bit whether this time frame that's being discussed is realistic? So I think in some circumstances, we hear people saying that health workers might be immunized this summer. Does that sound feasible to you?
In essence, it's very ambitious, no matter how you look at it. There are steps that you have to take in the testing of a vaccine, both for safety and for efficacy. And they really don't reduce very well. The one thing that we have seen that has been salutary is the fact that 63 days after the sequencing of the genome of the virus was completed, tests have begun on actually putting a candidate vaccine into the arms of a small group of volunteers. That's just the first step, where you really just are assessing this for safety and seeing if these few people will mount any kind of an antibody response, which is a clue as to whether you've got an immune response going. But then you move to several hundred people where you have to kind of establish the level of antigen that has to be used for effectiveness and also safety again. And then you have to, after you've assessed that, moving into several thousand people. All of these have to be while virus is circulating in the area to see if you really have an effective vaccine. So it's ambitious, it's something we have to do, but at the same time, we have to be cautious about expectations.
Lois, you were saying that maybe one route people are looking at is emergency use. Explain to us a bit more about that and what that might involve.
Well, emergency use is just being able to get it out there quickly. I think we're in the midst of having to do something and having to do it right away. So you want to make sure that a vaccine could be used, and that's what they're talking about with the early candidates of vaccine, is being able to get it out there and get it in use in healthcare workers. You know, some of the things that we're going to need to really figure out within this whole process is who we actually are even going to be giving this vaccine to. We don't know whether it's something that we're trying to target the transmitters of disease to try and slow the spread of disease, whether we're going to be targeting the elderly, and in which case they're a really tough group to target because they require more of a response. What is the formulation of vaccine? What is the packaging? What is the form that it comes in? You know, is this an injectable vaccine which requires a trained health professional? Or are we going to be considering things like patches or oral formulations or other formulations that can change the game of how you deliver the vaccine in the face of a contagious disease?
So, Joelle, you spent most of your career working in industry. How feasible is it, if we're talking about the general population, we're talking about hundreds of billions or hundreds of millions or billions even of people, how feasible is it to scale up production like that? Is there that sort of capacity sitting in the vaccine sector?
At the point in time, the answer is no. All the productions are extremely specific. So it will require, in the best possible option, several months to have only a few millions of doses in the best possible scenario.
Lois, if this is a classically delivered vaccine, if it's an injection, that poses a particular problem at the moment because we have so many problems with patients getting access to healthcare professionals. But I suppose we also have to accept that it may not be a one-dose vaccine, right?
The current candidates, we're looking at 2-dose vaccines. So you imagine that you have that risk of going, you know, to get your immunization for the first dose, and then you have to come back a certain time later. So you need to think about compliance and how well the vaccine is going to perform, you know, at that first dose, and whether people even come back, and whether they look at an injection and just decide, you know, again, I'm not going to do it, because it's all a matter of does the person that's getting the vaccine perceive this as a risk at that point in time? And if you fast forward a couple of years or 3 years, when many people believe that they maybe have already been exposed to the vaccine, that becomes a real question in mind. You know, if we have an injectable vaccine, are they going to take it? If you have some other type of formulation, does that, you know, again, change the game?
All the models I've seen suggest that 60 to 80% of people will probably have been exposed. Either, if you look at the Oxford model, they may have been exposed already. The Oxford model says up to 60% of people in industrialized countries may already have been exposed. If you look at the Imperial model, it says, well, within 18 months, certainly, we would expect to have 80-85% of people exposed. Is there a chance that we'll get a vaccine and it won't actually be any use to anybody?
Of course, this is a novel virus. We've never had any experience with it. We've seen with SARS, which was a very lethal coronavirus, and it kind of evanesced. We don't know whether this one is going to be with us a long time. So it makes sense now, rather than to change your mind later, to proceed with a vaccine, because it's the most prudent thing we can do, I think.
We might also want to be thinking about a pan-coronavirus vaccine, because there are a lot of viruses. There's likely that there will be other emerging infections, and we don't know, maybe this one will die out or may not. And it's a real question, but maybe there's other viruses that we also need to be protected against, and that this pandemic is not hitting all parts of the world equally. So there are going to be people that are perhaps protected, but there's going to be a lot of people that are coming into communities, traveling across borders, that will not be. There's ethical questions of, you know, do you give it to the people that are likely to have the most severe effect or impact? Is it something that is based on the surge capacity of a country, you know, number of ventilators available or things like that? So
but this might well, at least in part, end up looking like yellow fever, where you need a certificate in order to be able to travel. You need.
If you have a duration of protection by the natural disease, which is the same that the yellow fever, for instance, your assumption that the vaccine will be pointless is relevant. And another point, it is frequently described that in pandemic, it is classically in two waves. Even if the second wave is not of the same magnitude, if you have a vaccine at the time, it would be at least to control this wave.
I also wanted to come back to you, Joël, because something that Lois just mentioned now, MERS and SARS are still with us, right? But it's not as if MERS and SARS disappeared. We routinely find just that there is a quite high level of immunity to it.
This is what is interesting when you mention SARS and MERS is that it shows some positive for the community. It seems that we learned already quite a lot from these various episodes, and we are saving time. I think there is some lessons learned which are of importance in this story.
But I think, you know, one of the things that we also have to mention is that even once we have a vaccine, it still takes quite a while to deploy those vaccines in country.
It's absolutely true. All the different phases described by Lenore and the timeline for production are extremely in contradiction with the emergency we face today. Having said so, there is some positive in the story of the COVID-19, which is the unseen richness of the R&D ecosystem for COVID-19. There is a lot of candidate vaccine, which was not the case for neither SARS, nor MERS, nor Ebola, or any other previous infectious crisis. There is a lot of different countries where research is productive. There is a lot of different technologies. There is a lot of different type of teams which are on the starting line. You have the public sector, you have the private sector, you have big multinational companies, you have biotechs. The diversity is for me positive, and it's certainly better to have this richness with us than what we had before, where we were almost relying exclusively on the public American sector.
But Lenore, that diversity has a downside, right? In that many of these vaccines, we don't really have much experience in producing many of these types of vaccines. We don't have much experience in producing at scale. Is that right?
We are ahead of the game a little bit in the fact that there is something called the Coalition for Economic Preparedness Innovations. It's based in Oslo, and they're driving this, and they have been for a while. So that kind of thinking is already in one place and moving ahead. And they point out that there are 35 companies, academic institutions, and government agencies already working in this, which for an epidemic or pandemic that's we've only known about for 5 months, if that is probably remarkable and will stand us in good stead. But this comes from, as you point out, the work on SARS and MERS that went before, where it was recognized that there were new threats arising all the time. If one company or academic institution were to come up with an arm-ready vaccine, that may be another company which had the capacity that would actually manufacture it. It would be a different kind of configuration, but in this situation, there may be a willingness to cooperate more than not.
But I think you also need more than one company out there because, you know, again, to meet the demand all around the world, it's important that you have multiple suppliers, because the last thing we want to do is we want, you know, end up with the H1N1 situation where your demand is there, but your supply is not there. And then by the time you get the product, demand diminishes. So you don't want to end up with that. And the other concern is that a lot of the groups that are working on vaccines right now, they're the biotechs. They don't necessarily have experience. There is big pharma, but a lot of them don't have experience in introducing vaccines throughout the world. And it is a complicated process, and it is one where you can really stumble and end up taking years to even get there because the cost is too high or it doesn't meet the requirements, you know, the temperature in that country, or, you haven't done your due diligence to know how to get it actually through the process. Fortunately, we have some good examples, like with the Men-A vaccine from Serum Institute. That was something that was able to make it there in record time. But it was only able to make it there in record time because you had a group behind it that was really focused on these downstream efforts as well as the upstream efforts to be able to study the vaccine and develop it, so it can get licensed.
There are two other things I'm really keen to cover before we finish the podcast. One is the impact of this pandemic on other global immunization programs. So Lois reminded me before we started that there are lots of pediatric diseases that are potentially terrifying. What do you all think the impact of the epidemic so far, whether there's a vaccine for it or not, will be on other diseases and other immunization programs?
So first, I think we have to take the realistic scenario where it is impacting routine immunization. People can't get to their health provider, they can't get to clinics to be immunized regularly. And once that becomes less of a habit, you worry that after the pandemic is over, that there won't be that extra impetus to get people in.
Joelle, should we be worried about polio? Should we be worried about measles?
It's true that if in some territories there is a complete disruption of the continuity of the health systems, the consequences both for polio and measles could be a disaster, really.
I suppose what we have on our side is that, at least for polio, we have pretty high levels of coverage in many countries against polio. So it's unlikely that, at least as long as we maintain, and it's a long-lasting immunity, so it's unlikely we'll see a rapid spread back, or is that a false comfort?
I think it's a false comfort because all the newborns will not be vaccinated. So it will be very quickly that you will have a significant part of the population that will become a new reservoir, which is exactly what we aim to reduce in the polio strategy.
Lenore, I know some people worry that we struggle every year to get flu immunization rates at an acceptable level, and some of us succeed and some of us fail. Could that be at risk from this pandemic?
Well, you could look at it a different way too, and actually it could have a beneficial effect. I think the certainly in the industrialized world, the linkage for good and ill between the two diseases, COVID-19 and influenza, has been conflated, sometimes to the effect of reducing the perception of the threat that COVID presents. But in terms of administration, this could be, and we've seen this with influenza and pneumococcal immunization, that you can administer these concomitantly, and actually it can work very well. If these two could be administered simultaneously or in the same visit, it could be the doctor would say, it's time for your flu immunization. We're going to get this other one too, and then you've got this respiratory protection. So, I mean, it really all depends upon how it's perceived.
Well, that actually brings me on to the last topic I really wanted to cover, which is the anti-vax movement. And will it be, as you said, will it be that people are worried enough about this threat that the wilder extremes of the anti-vax movement won't be able to thrive, or do we run risks that actually we may give comfort to some of the anti-vaxxers?
I do think that there is a real risk that we may spur additional anti-vaccine sentiment. Right now, we're doing things for a good reason because people are scared and they're wanting a vaccine as soon as possible. But we're also moving a lot more quickly than we normally do. And there may be some sentiment that we're going too quickly and that perhaps we're skipping steps. The other thing is we don't know about some of these vaccines and how safe they'll be. So a lot of it will depend on the vaccine itself.
But we have had cases in the past where vaccines have been introduced too fast, and there have indeed been problems that haven't been seen in abridged clinical trials.
Well, I think the dengue vaccine is a good example of that, and some of the concerns that could be out there. And you're not just concerned about a single vaccine, you're concerned about the impact on all of the other vaccines and what type of confidence this gives in the community.
Then on the other side too, there's rotavirus, which was introduced, and when it was introduced into a very large population, complications surfaced that probably could not have been seen in a smaller clinical trial. And that sometimes we have to accept that trade-off in vaccine development, that when it's introduced in a large population, you may well see adverse events, and that's the chance we take.
I see a domain where very little innovation has been injected, and it's unfortunate because a lot is done in terms of information technology, is the way the information on safety is collected. It could be done enormously online if we want to be creative. It could be done safely, anonymously, and it could bring a lot of data in a certainly quick period of time, short period of time, and this would be for the better.
I couldn't agree with that more, because we definitely do not have a culture of data, or a culture of enough data. And getting to that point, I think, could allay a lot of fears. And I think it's the responsible thing to be watching for signals and being able to constantly communicate what you're doing, because that also helps build confidence.
Well, thank you all. I mean, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Before we finish, I want to ask Kieran to give us a little overview of the discussion that's taking place in media and social media about vaccines in relation to COVID-19. So I know you've been doing some research, Kieran.
Thank you, Mark. So what we found is that since January, when the COVID-19 pandemic first started to gather traction, before obviously it was declared a pandemic, the idea of a vaccine for the coronavirus actually gained steady traction in the traditional media, which showed a gradual increase in articles mentioning both coronavirus and vaccination. Social media, on the other hand, differed considerably. It was a lot more variable in terms of article topics. But what is interesting is that we saw 4 distinct peaks discussing vaccination on February the 27th, March the 3rd, March the 9th, and March the 16th. And the interest across all of those peaks was steadily increasing. Coverage appears to be overwhelmingly negative on the face of it, but this doesn't necessarily reflect an anti-vaccination viewpoint. It could be interpreted in a number of ways, including developments such as President Donald Trump announcing that a vaccine would be ready ahead of schedule, as well as the general negativity of the coronavirus coverage. But what is also interesting is the increasing interest in the coronavirus vaccine and how this is intersecting with how different pharma brands are gaining coverage, as well as biotech firms. So we've mentioned the SII earlier. We've also had Gilead and Pfizer and Moderna all sort of wading into the vaccine market as far as coronavirus is concerned. And they've seen spikes in coverage, which has always been centered along the lines of drug or vaccine development and collaboration, showing there is an interest out there in coronavirus vaccination. And I think that as the situation develops, we're going to see a lot more interest as far as that goes.
And it's interesting that Gilead showing up in a discussion of vaccines suggests that there's a good deal of confusion in the reporting as well, which I suppose isn't a surprise to any of us. Thank you very much, Kieran. Then I'd particularly like to thank all of our panelists today. I'd like to thank Lois Prevodum from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and where she's Director of Policy, Advocacy and Communications. I'd like to thank Lenore Cooney, founder of Baird CMC, who is an expert within the company on immunization and has worked on advocacy and convening support. And Joël Calmet, the former Head of Scientific Communications at Sanofi Pasteur, who's now also an advisor to Baird CMC. So thank you very much for joining us. I do hope you'll join us next week and leave any feedback for us on how we can make this podcast more useful and more relevant. Thank you. Next week, on our 4th episode of Pandemicast, we're going to look at the impact of the pandemic on the treatment of other conditions, especially in the developing world. So conditions that remain as serious, maybe more serious, conditions that may be aggravated by COVID-19, which are at risk of being forgotten. Tuberculosis, top of the list.